She caught the scalpel without looking. That was the moment everything changed, though no one understood it yet. The instrument slipped from Dr. Harlan Voss's fingers during a controlled demonstration, spinning end over end toward the tiled floor of Harbor Ridge Medical Center's main trauma bay. Emily Carter's left hand shot out, snatched it from the air, and set it on the nearest tray. Clean, quiet, like she'd done it 1,000 times. The room went still. Emily didn't look up from the supply cart she was inventorying. Her face gave nothing away. No pride, no awareness that 23 people had just watched something that shouldn't have been physically possible. "Where did you learn to move like that?" someone asked. Emily finally looked up, her expression mild, unremarkable. "I pay attention," she said, and went back to counting saline bags. No one laughed. Not yet. That would come later. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who've already decided what you are, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit like, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter arrived at Harbor Ridge Medical Center on a Tuesday in mid-October, which meant the ER was already running 3 nurses short. The trauma bays smelled like old coffee and antiseptic, and nobody had time to properly orient a new hire. She was given a locker, a badge, and 45 minutes with a charge nurse named Dolores Fitch, who was 52, perpetually exhausted, and had precisely 0 patients for hand-holding. "Trauma 1 through 4 on the East Hall," Dolores said, walking fast. "Procedure rooms are behind the nurse's station. Supply closet codes are on the board. You'll memorize them in 2 days, or you won't last 2 weeks. Questions?" "Where does the O-neg live?" Emily asked. Dolores glanced at her sideways. "Blood bank refrigerator, trauma hallway, 2nd shelf." "And the crash carts?" "1 per bay, checked every morning at 6. You on that rotation?" "I can be," Emily said. Dolores stopped walking and looked at her properly for the first time. Emily met her gaze, steady, patient, giving away nothing. Dolores made a sound that wasn't quite approval and moved on. That was the most meaningful conversation Emily had with anyone at Harbor Ridge for the first 2 weeks. She was 34 years old and had a resume that looked, to the untrained eye, like she'd spent her career doing very little. 2 years at a rural clinic in Montana. 1 year contracted through a staffing agency that no longer existed. A nursing license she'd obtained through a program in a state where nobody was likely to call for references. She had no hospital system experience listed, no letters of recommendation, no professional affiliations. She was quiet in the way that reads, to people who aren't paying attention, as either shy or dull. She kept her blonde hair pulled back tight and wore no jewelry. She never lingered after shifts. She ate lunch alone in the break room when it was empty, and she was efficient in a way that somehow failed to register as competence. Because her efficiency looked effortless, and people tend to value visible effort. What people at Harbor Ridge saw was an unimpressive woman in her mid-30s with a vague background and no apparent ambition. What they missed was everything else. They missed the way her eyes swept every room she entered, cataloging exits and obstacles in the time it took most people to find a chair. They missed the fact that she could hear a patient's breathing pattern change from across a busy hallway. They missed the way her hands moved during procedures. Not fast, exactly, but precise in a way that bypassed uncertainty entirely. The way hands move when the margin for error was, for a long time, 0. They missed those things because they weren't looking. They'd already decided what she was. Dr. Nathan Cole was the kind of man who filled a room without necessarily improving it. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he'd stopped examining whether it was true. He'd been ER director at Harbor Ridge for 3 years, which was long enough to have reshaped the department in his image. Fast, aggressive, hierarchical, and deeply intolerant of anything he couldn't immediately categorize. He noticed Emily the way he noticed most new nursing staff, briefly and dismissively. She didn't present as someone worth his attention. She wasn't loud, didn't perform competence in the ways he'd learned to recognize, and came without the institutional pedigree that would have made her legible to him. "Carter," he said, on her 5th day, stopping at the nurse's station where she was charting. "What's your trauma background?" "General ER nursing," she said, not looking up. "Some rural trauma." Rural trauma. He said it the way people say participation trophy. "So, basic airway management, maybe some fracture stabilization." And a few other things, she said. He waited. She didn't elaborate. He moved on. It was the not elaborating, that began to irritate him. Nathan Cole was not accustomed to people who didn't try to impress him, and there was something in Emily's calm that he read as either stupidity or arrogance, and he wasn't sure which one annoyed him more. The other nurses, for the most part, absorbed her quietly. Roseanne Teal, who had 13 years in the ER and a dry humor that served as the department's emotional infrastructure, watched Emily for a week before rendering a verdict. "She's either very good or very weird," Roseanne told Dolores during the 4A. Though that was the only time anyone at Harbor Ridge actually talked. "Can't it be both?" Dolores said. "In this place? Probably." What neither of them could quite articulate was the texture of Emily's competence. It wasn't showy. It didn't announce itself. But things went smoothly around her in ways that you only noticed in retrospect. The IV that threaded cleanly on the first stick when everyone else had been struggling with a difficult vein. The medication dosage she'd quietly corrected before it reached the patient. The patient who'd been getting worse in a way nobody pinpointed until Emily flagged it and the team found the internal bleed they'd missed. She didn't make speeches about these things. She just did them and moved on, which, in a hospital culture that ran on visibility and credit and professional positioning, made her effectively invisible. The scalpel incident happened on a Wednesday. During a technique demonstration, Dr. Voss was running for 2 residents and a cluster of nurses who'd been voluntarily recruited to observe. Harlan Voss was a cardiothoracic surgeon who occasionally drifted down to the ER when things were interesting, and he was the kind of teacher who used props, physical demonstrations, exaggerated gestures, theatrical emphasis. He was making a point about instrument handling when the scalpel slipped. It was a genuine accident. The instrument spun free, angled downward, blade first. Emily's hand moved. The scalpel landed in her palm, handle side, with no drama whatsoever. She set it on the tray and continued what she'd been doing, which was not much. She'd been standing slightly outside the demonstration circle, listening while she organized supplies. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. "How did you—" one of the residents started. "She barely even looked," the other one said. Emily didn't respond. She handed the tray back to the circulating nurse and took half a step toward the hallway, clearly intending to leave. "Carter." Voss's voice stopped her. He was studying her with an expression that had shifted from startled to genuinely curious. "Where did you learn to move like that?" She turned back. Her expression was completely neutral. "I pay attention," she said, and then she was gone. The whisper started the way whispers always do in hospitals, quiet, fast, and everywhere within hours. By afternoon, the story had been told and retold enough times that some versions had Emily catching 2 instruments simultaneously, or catching them blind, or catching them while simultaneously charting with her other hand. The details inflated. The core remained. The blank resume nobody nurse had done something that shouldn't have been possible, and she'd done it without blinking. Some people were intrigued. Some were unsettled. Nathan Cole, when he heard the story from one of the residents, felt something closer to irritation. The culture at Harbor Ridge had a particular shape, and Emily didn't fit it cleanly. The ER ran on a hierarchy that was openly discussed and quietly enforced. Physicians at the top, then physician assistants, then the experienced nurses who'd been there long enough to be informally tolerated as equal voices in certain situations, then everyone else. New nurses, especially new nurses without impressive resumes, existed in a specific zone of low status that was expected to last at least 6 months. Emily didn't appear to notice this zone, which was its own kind of problem. She didn't challenge the hierarchy directly. She wasn't confrontational, didn't push back vocally, didn't compete for status. But she also didn't perform the deference that new staff were expected to perform. She answered questions directly when she had answers. She flagged concerns when she had concerns. She didn't pad her observations with apologies or qualifiers, and she didn't root her observations through the nurses who outranked her before speaking to physicians. To the physicians who were secure in themselves, this read as straightforward. Roseanne, who had been doing this for 13 years and had no patience for performance, found it refreshing. To Nathan Cole, it read as insubordination wearing the mask of incompetence. "She acts like she has credentials she doesn't have," he said to Dr. Voss on a Thursday afternoon, in the alcove near the imaging suite where private conversations were briefly possible. Voss shrugged. "She's good. I've been watching her." She's a rural nurse with a gap-filled resume who moves like she's been through some kind of combat training. That's not a profile that makes sense. Maybe she did a lot of outdoor sports, Voss said, without particular investment. That's not what that is. Nathan's jaw was tight. I'm going to look into her background more carefully. Voss looked at him for a moment. Why? Because something doesn't add up. Nathan. Voss's tone was mild but direct. She's a good nurse who makes your residents look sloppy by doing nothing visibly impressive. Let it go. Nathan didn't let it go. The next thing happened on a Tuesday night, which was when Phoenix decided, as it periodically did, to generate chaos. 3 MVAs came in within 40 minutes of each other, which was already a difficult load. The fourth arrival was a man in his mid-50s named Marcus Greer, construction worker, dropped at the ambulance bay entrance by a coworker who'd panicked and driven away. So there was no paramedic report, no vitals history, no mechanism of injury clearly established. Greer was conscious but barely, answering questions in single syllables, skin pale and clammy. The triage nurse flagged him as priority 2 and moved him to trauma 3. Emily was in the hallway when they wheeled him past. She watched him for 4 seconds. Then she followed the gurney into the bay, which she hadn't been assigned to. This isn't your patient, the assigned nurse, a man named Derek, told her. His breathing's wrong, Emily said. She was already at the bedside, fingers on Greer's wrist, eyes on his chest. Watch the way he's moving air. It's not matching his distress level. Derek looked. He's talking. Airway's clear. His right side is lagging, she said. She picked up the stethoscope from the hook on the wall and listened. Both sides, front and back, fast and methodical. Decreased breath sounds, right lower lobe. Heart rate's compensating. He may have a tension component building. You can't diagnose. I'm not diagnosing. I'm telling you what I'm hearing. She set the stethoscope down. Get the attending in here. Derek hesitated, the complex social calculation of whether to be annoyed or alarmed playing across his face, and then went for the attending. The attending was Dr. Priya Suresh, who had been covering since 6 a.m. and was operating on approximately her 3rd wind. She came in tired and slightly impatient, listened to Emily's report, and did her own auscultation. Her face changed. Tension pneumo, she said. Get a 14 gauge, prep for needle decompression. Greer's oxygen saturation was at 82 and dropping. The procedure took 90 seconds. The rush of air when the needle went in was audible. Greer's color started returning within 2 minutes, and by the time they had a chest tube in and him stabilized, his SATs were climbing back toward normal, and he was making complaints about his back pain, which meant he had enough oxygen to have opinions, which was a good sign. Priya Suresh looked at Emily across the gurney. How did you catch that? She asked. His breathing pattern was off from his presentation, Emily said. Didn't match what you'd expect from the vitals alone. Most people wouldn't have caught it this fast. Emily started gathering used materials for disposal. Most people weren't watching him, she said. It should have been a moment. In a functional environment, it might have been. The kind of catch that gets mentioned, the kind of contribution that shifts how someone is perceived. What it became instead was fuel. Nathan Cole heard about the Greer case from Derek, who framed it, not deliberately, but through the particular lens of his own discomfort, as Emily overstepping, acting outside her assignment, second-guessing the triage system. The detail about the tension pneumo didn't land the way it should have, because Derek led with the process complaint and the clinical accuracy got buried. Nathan's response was immediate and disproportionate. He pulled Emily into his office the next morning. The office was a glass-walled room off the main ER corridor, and he didn't close the blinds, which meant anyone passing could see them without hearing them. Emily noticed this. She didn't comment on it. You went into an unassigned bay last night, he said. I did, she said. You don't get to make those calls. The patient presented with signs of tension pneumothorax that weren't being addressed. I flagged it to the attending. You don't have the clinical background to... The attending confirmed the diagnosis and performed the decompression, Emily said. Her voice was even. The patient is in stable condition. Nathan leaned forward. I've been looking at your file, Carter. Your credentials are thin. Your references are thin. The clinic you worked at in Montana, that number's been disconnected. Did you know that? Something moved behind Emily's eyes. Very briefly. Gone, almost immediately. Clinics close, she said. And the staffing agency you contracted through? Also closed. Agencies fold. It's a lot of things that can't be verified. My nursing license can be verified. I'm licensed in this state. I passed the board exam. Everything required for this position is documented. What I'm questioning, Nathan said, is whether your clinical experience matches what you're performing in my ER. Emily was quiet for a moment. I don't understand what you're asking me to do differently, she said. I'm not performing anything. I'm doing my job. Then do it inside your lane. She looked at him. He looked back. The silence between them was not comfortable. Is there anything else? She asked. I'm watching you, he said. That's all. She left. He watched her walk through the corridor, back straight, pace unhurried. He was already picking up his phone. Whoa. The complaint he filed was technically worded but strategically targeted. It cited Emily's incursion into an unassigned bay, questioned the appropriateness of her clinical assertions, and raised concerns about the verifiability of her prior experience. It was routed to the hospital's credentialing committee and to human resources simultaneously, which was unusual, the kind of move that signals intent, not just concern. Roseanne found out the way Roseanne found out everything, which was by existing in the right place at the right time and paying attention. She told Dolores. Dolores told 2 other nurses who told 4 others, and by the end of the second shift, the ER staff was divided into the people who thought Nathan had overreacted and the people who thought maybe he had a point. She does seem a little, I don't know, one of the younger nurses said, during a break room conversation Emily wasn't present for. Like she knows things she shouldn't know. It's a little weird. She saved someone's life, Roseanne said flatly. I know, but nothing. Emily, during all of this, went about her shifts. She didn't ask anyone what was being said. She didn't attempt to cultivate allies or manage her reputation. She came in, did her work, and left. Which is not what someone performing a fraud would do, but it's also not what someone playing the game would do. And Harbor Ridge Medical Center ran, at its core, on people playing the game. What nobody asked was the obvious question. If Emily Carter was falsifying her background, why was her clinical instinct so accurate? Why did her interventions hold up? Why did the patients she touched do better? The answer to that question, the real answer, would have changed everything, but nobody was asking it yet.
But the
The credentialing review took 11 days. During those 11 days, Emily kept working. The committee's preliminary concern was enough to flag her for enhanced supervision, which meant that every clinical decision she made was technically subject to secondary review, which meant a layer of friction on everything she touched. She adapted to this without comment. Priya Suresh, for her part, went out of her way to be fair. She watched Emily work for 4 straight shifts. She read the Greer case documentation 3 times. And she went to Nathan with what she found. Her instincts are better than 90% of the nurses I've worked with, Priya told him. The way she assessed that patient was textbook tension pneumo workup, clean, fast, correctly prioritized. That's exactly what concerns me, Nathan said. It concerns you that she's competent. It concerns me that she's competent in ways that don't match her documented experience. He set a folder on his desk. I ran a background check through a private service. Emily Carter, age 34, nursing license current and valid. But before 4 years ago? Nothing. No credit history, no address history, no employment records. It's like she didn't exist. Priya was quiet for a moment. People change their names, she said. People leave bad situations. Or they build false identities. You're reaching. Someone with combat-level reflexes and clinical instincts that don't match her resume, with a history that doesn't exist before 4 years ago. Nathan's voice was controlled but tight. That's not a reach. That's a pattern. Priya left his office with the uneasy feeling that Nathan was simultaneously right and wrong in the worst possible combination. Right, that something was off. Wrong about what it meant. The credentialing committee's report came back inconclusive, which in hospital bureaucracy language meant, we can't confirm, we can't deny, we recommend further review. Nathan took it to the hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Foss, who had the institutional reflexes of someone who had survived 17 years in healthcare administration. He moved toward liability avoidance, the way a plant moves toward light. Precautionary suspension, Gerald said, until the review is complete. For how long? Until it's complete. Emily was notified on a Thursday morning before her shift started. She read the letter standing at the nurse's station, her face doing the thing it always did, which was nothing visible. She signed the acknowledgement form, turned in her badge, and walked out through the ambulance bay entrance. Roseanne watched her go. Dolores watched Roseanne watch Emily go. "That was wrong," Roseanne said quietly. "A lot of things are wrong," Dolores said. Nobody noticed the man in the waiting room who had been there for the better part of an hour. He wasn't a patient. He was in his late 40s, lean in the particular way of someone who'd maintained physical conditioning across decades, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that, if you knew what to look for, was identical to Emily's. He'd come in through the main entrance and taken a seat against the far wall, with a clear sightline to the main corridor. He'd been watching the ER. When Emily walked out through the ambulance bay, he stood up, unhurried. He reached into his jacket pocket and looked at his phone. He read something there, and his expression, which had been professionally neutral, went very briefly, very quietly, dark. He typed something short. Then he put the phone away and walked out the main entrance. 3 hours later, a black SUV with government plates pulled into the hospital's visitor parking structure and stayed there. Nobody connected these things yet. Nobody had reason to. But in a conference room somewhere in Phoenix that afternoon, a man with silver hair and a rank that made hospital administrators straighten involuntarily was looking at a file that bore the name Captain Emily Rains, formerly classified, medical records sealed under NDAA provision, and making a phone call that would, within 72 hours, make the entire credentialing review at Harbor Ridge Medical Center completely irrelevant. The hospital had suspended one of their nurses. They had no idea who they'd just made an enemy of. The phone call lasted 4 minutes. The man with silver hair, whose name was Warren Keel, though that detail belonged to a category of information that didn't travel casually, made the call from the parking structure and said very little. He listened more than he spoke. When he hung up, he sat in the vehicle for a moment with his hands flat on his thighs, looking at nothing in particular, doing the internal arithmetic of someone who has just confirmed something they had hoped not to confirm. Then he started the engine and drove. Emily's apartment was 14 minutes from Harbor Ridge, which she had chosen deliberately, far enough that she didn't have to think about the hospital when she was home. Close enough that she could be there fast if she had to be, though she had never let herself examine too closely why that particular calculation still mattered to her. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after she got home. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't make coffee. She just sat, hands wrapped around nothing, looking at the middle distance in the way of someone running through scenarios. Not panicking, because she didn't panic, but running through scenarios seriously and without comfort. The suspension itself wasn't the problem. Suspensions could be managed, reversed, outlasted. The problem was the background check Nathan Cole had commissioned through a private service, and what that service may or may not have found, and who else might eventually see those results. 4 years ago, she had built Emily Carter carefully. Good license, legitimate transcript, plausible employment history. Gaps, yes, but explainable gaps. The kind of resume a person has when they've spent their 20s moving around, working contract jobs, not building a career so much as surviving 1 year at a time. What she hadn't been able to build was a history before age 29 that would survive rigorous scrutiny. Because Emily Carter hadn't existed before age 29. Emily Rains had. And Emily Rains was a name that, in certain databases, was attached to a seal she had not broken and had no intention of breaking. She got up from the table, went to the window, and looked out at the parking lot below. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan. 2 kids were arguing on the sidewalk about something she couldn't hear. The afternoon was completely ordinary. She pulled out her phone and stared at it for almost a minute before putting it back in her pocket without making a call. She was not going to be the one who made that call. She had promised herself that 4 years ago, and she wasn't going back on it now. What she would do instead was wait and think and be ready for whatever came next, that she could do, that she had been doing, in one form or another, for most of her adult life. Harbor Ridge Medical Center did not slow down because Emily Carter was gone. The ER ran at its usual controlled chaos. Trauma bays cycled through patients. Staff rotated in and out of shifts with the automatic rhythm of a system that had learned to absorb individual departures without breaking stride. Nobody announced Emily's suspension publicly. These things traveled through the department the way most things did, through overheard conversations and break room inference and the pointed absence of someone who had been quietly present for weeks. Nathan Cole came into work the next morning looking like a man who had resolved something, which is a particular kind of energy that is both recognizable and faintly unpleasant. He ran the morning briefing with an additional crispness to his delivery. He reviewed the overnight shift notes with focused attention. He said nothing about Emily directly. Roseanne Teal watched all of this from the nurse's station and kept her mouth shut, which cost her more than usual. Derek, for his part, was uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected to be. The Greer case had been documented. The outcome was in the record. Reading it back now, the nursing note Emily had filed, Priya Suresh's physician note confirming the diagnosis, the procedure documentation, the patient's discharge status. It read clean and unambiguous. Emily had flagged a life-threatening condition that the triage system had underclassified. The patient had gone home 4 days later. She wasn't wrong about the patient, Derek said to a colleague named Joelle, not loudly, in the equipment room. No, Joelle agreed. Cole suspended her anyway. Cole suspended her over process, Joelle said, with the particular precision of someone choosing their words around an audience that might exist. She went into an unassigned bay. To save a guy's life. Joelle didn't answer that because there wasn't an answer that didn't make someone look bad. The discomfort settled into the ER like low-grade weather. Present, uncomfortable, not quite bad enough to force a confrontation. People went about their shifts. Cases came in. The work continued. What nobody at Harbor Ridge knew was that 40 miles south, in a field office attached to a building whose function was not advertised on its exterior signage, 2 men were looking at a personnel file and having a conversation that was quiet and controlled and moving fast toward a conclusion. The file belonged to Nathan Cole. Warren Keel had been following a different thread when Cole's name surfaced. Not a thread connected to Harbor Ridge Medical Center, not initially, and not connected to any suspended nurse. The thread he'd been following was older and considerably more serious, and it had been moving slowly for almost 18 months. What accelerated it was the background check. The private investigation firm Nathan Cole had hired to look into Emily Carter's past was not a standard service. It billed itself as a corporate due diligence operation, employment verification, credential validation, standard professional background screening. What it also did, which was not in the brochure, was run queries against databases it had no legal authorization to access, through a network of relationships and data brokers that existed in the space between legal gray area and federal violation. The firm had done this many times. The results usually went to corporate clients who wanted to know things about employees that HR channels couldn't tell them. Most of the time, the information was mundane. This time, one of the query strings had pinged a flag in a monitoring system that had been running quietly for nearly 2 years. The flag reached Warren Keel's desk, metaphorically. The system sent a notification to a secure terminal within 6 hours. The query had been run against a sealed record. The seal was military. The record was attached to a name that, if you knew the context, explained everything about a blonde nurse in an Arizona ER who caught falling instruments without looking. Keel had known Emily Raines, though not well. He knew her record, the way you know the records of people who had done things in conditions that didn't get written up cleanly. She had gone quiet 4 years ago, and he had let her go quiet because she'd earned that, and because the system owed her more than it had delivered, and because some people come back from what she'd been through and some people don't. And it wasn't his place to pull her back if she'd chosen a different life. But now someone had gone looking, and the someone who'd gone looking had a history that Keel's team had been assembling for 18 months, and that history was not the history of a jealous hospital administrator with a grudge. He's been running queries for 2 years, the analyst across the table from Keel said. His name was Bram. He was 31 and had the look of someone who had been sleeping poorly for months. Mostly targeting veteran medical personnel, cross-referencing former combat medics, trauma specialists, field surgeons, people with operational backgrounds who've transitioned into civilian medicine. What's he doing with the information? Keel asked. We're not sure yet. The data transfer patterns suggest he's passing it somewhere, but the routing is layered enough that we haven't traced the endpoint. How many people has he identified? Bram looked at his screen. We can confirm 11. We think the actual number is higher. Keel was quiet for a moment. And Carter, Raines, she's one of his more recent queries. He ran a soft query 10 days ago, standard verification type, the kind that wouldn't usually trip a flag, but the underlying string targeted the sealed record. Did he get anything? We don't think so. The seal held, but he knows there's a seal. That alone tells him something. Bram paused. He suspended her this week. I know, Keel said. You think he made her? Keel didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about a woman sitting alone in an apartment, deciding not to make a phone call. He was thinking about what it costs a person to bury themselves that deep and how much it costs when someone starts digging. I think he got close enough to make him nervous, Keel said. And nervous people do things. What do we do? Keel picked up his phone. We move faster than we planned to. Emily spent 2 days in her apartment. She ran in the mornings, early, before the Phoenix heat became punishing. She cooked simple food and ate it without appetite. She went over her options with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been trained to assess situations without sentiment, and each time she came out at the same place. She could wait, she could run, or she could find out what Nathan Cole actually knew and how bad it was. Running was off the table. She'd decided that a long time ago. She was done running. Waiting felt passive in a way that didn't sit well with her, but it was also the strategically sound option if she didn't know what she was moving against yet, which left finding out. On the third day, she drove back toward Harbor Ridge, not to the hospital, but to the coffee shop 2 blocks east of it, which was where a portion of the off-duty medical staff went to decompress between shifts. She knew this because she'd observed it, the way she observed everything, without appearing to observe anything. She ordered coffee she didn't particularly want and took a table near the window. Roseanne Teal came in at 2:15, still in her scrubs, moving like someone whose feet hurt, which they probably did. She saw Emily immediately. She stood in the middle of the coffee shop for a moment, doing a calculation Emily recognized, the social calculation of whether to engage. And then she walked over and sat down across from her without being asked. You look fine, Roseanne said. It wasn't a compliment so much as a report. I am fine, Emily said. People are talking. I'd be surprised if they weren't. Roseanne studied her. You're not worried. I'm thinking, Emily said. Those aren't the same thing. Cole is... Roseanne stopped, started again. He's going further than the standard review. He's contacted people at the staffing board. He's trying to pull more records than the credentialing committee asked for. Emily absorbed this without changing expression. How do you know that? Gerald Foss's assistant is a friend. She doesn't share specifics. Roseanne wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. But she said whatever Cole is looking for, he's looking hard. The information settled in Emily's chest with the weight of something confirmed rather than something new. Roseanne, Emily said, what does the ER think of what he did? Honestly. Roseanne looked at her for a moment. Honestly? It's split. The ones who liked you think it was wrong. The ones who were already uncomfortable with you think there must be a reason. She paused. Derek feels bad. Not bad enough to say anything publicly, but bad. The Greer case is documented, Emily said. Whatever Cole does with my suspension, that's in the record. Yes, Roseanne said. It is. She looked out the window. There's something else. I probably shouldn't tell you this. Then don't. I'm going to anyway. Roseanne turned back to her. Priya Suresh went to Cole after the review started. She told him Emily's clinical instincts were better than most nurses she'd worked with, that the Greer call was textbook clean, that the committee's review was based on process, not performance. Roseanne's voice was flat. He thanked her for her input and filed the suspension anyway. Emily said nothing. He's not doing this because he thinks you're incompetent, Roseanne said. I think you know that. Emily picked up her coffee. I know that, she said. So what are you going to do? Emily looked out the window at the street. The afternoon traffic was moving steadily. Everything looked normal. Everything always looked normal until it didn't. I'm going to let it play out a little longer, she said. Roseanne made a sound that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite acceptance. She finished her coffee. She left. Emily sat at the window for another 20 minutes, thinking about a man who was looking too hard for information she had kept carefully buried, and wondering whether he understood what he had started. What Nathan Cole understood was less than he thought and more than was safe. He understood that Emily Carter's background had holes in it that weren't explainable by ordinary life circumstances. He understood that the private firm he'd retained had hit a wall, Specifically, a sealed record of some kind that had generated a soft denial and a logged query alert, though the firm hadn't told him about the logged alert because they didn't know about it. He understood that Emily's reflexes and clinical instincts were significantly above what her documented experience could account for. What he didn't understand was that he was not operating in isolation. For 18 months, he had been doing things that he had compartmentalized with the kind of precision that made him feel safe. Careful data transfers, careful questions routed through careful channels, a network of connections that he had maintained with the particular discipline of someone who knew exactly how much trouble they were in if any of it came apart. He had run his ER with genuine competence. He had published 2 papers in the last 3 years. He had a daughter who was 10 years old and a wife who didn't know what he did with certain Tuesday evenings when he said he was working late. He had started small, the way these things always start. A former acquaintance from medical school, a job offer that paid too well for what it asked, a first transfer of information that seemed minor and was framed as minor and which had, over time, evolved into something that would end his life as he knew it if it ever came into the light. The Emily Carter situation was, in his mind, a separate problem, a local problem. A nurse with a suspicious background who moved in ways she shouldn't move and knew things she shouldn't know, and who had been, thankfully cleanly, suspended through legitimate channels. His next step was to push the credentialing review toward a permanent revocation of her Arizona license, which would remove her from Harbor Ridge's orbit entirely and end his exposure there. He did not know about Warren Keel. He did not know about the logged query alert. He did not know that the private investigation firm he was using had, at some point in the past 6 months, been placed under monitored status by a federal agency whose name didn't appear on most organizational charts. He didn't know any of it. He was sitting in his office at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, the ER running below him, a glass of water on his desk and a folder open in front of him, when his cell phone buzzed with a text from a number he recognized and wished he didn't. The text said, "It flagged. Someone knows you ran it. Cut off and wait." Nathan stared at the phone. He read the message 3 times. His glass of water sat untouched. He thought about Emily Carter walking out of the hospital 2 days ago. He thought about the sealed record that the firm hadn't been able to crack. He thought about the query alert, which the firm apparently now knew about, even though they hadn't told him when it happened. He put the phone face down on the desk and pressed his palms flat on the surface and breathed. Then he did something that was, from a strategic standpoint, exactly the wrong move. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to the credentialing committee requesting an expedited review of Emily Carter's license suspension, pushing for permanent revocation on the grounds of documented falsification of professional history. He sent it at 8:47. He felt briefly more in control. He was not more in control. Rosanne Teal came back from her break at 9 p.m. to find the overnight trauma team setting up for a shift change and found Priya Suresh standing at the nurse's station, looking at something on the internal system with an expression Roseanne had learned to read, as concern she was trying to keep off her face. "What?" Roseanne said. "Cole sent an email to the committee," Priya said, "requesting expedited license revocation." Roseanne felt something cold move through her. "On what grounds?" "Documented falsification of professional history." Priya closed the screen. "Which is not what the committee found. They found inconclusive. He's pushing them toward a conclusion they didn't reach." "Can he do that?" "He's the ER director. He has standing to submit his professional assessment." Priya's voice was careful. "Whether the committee accepts it or not is a different question. But if they do, then Emily Carter loses her nursing license in Arizona and probably has to fight the revocation in every other state." Priya looked at Roseanne directly. "That's not a small thing. That's her career." Roseanne stood at the nurse's station and looked at the busy ER around her, the patients, the staff, the organized motion of a department doing what it was built to do, and felt the specific anger of someone watching something wrong happen through legitimate-looking channels. "She saved Marcus Greer's life," Roseanne said quietly. "I know," Priya said. "That's in the record." "I know that too." Neither of them said anything else. The trauma bay beeped. A resident called for help on a difficult IV. The night shift moved forward the way it always did, one patient at a time, indifferent to everything happening in the shadows around it. Emily's phone lit up at 9:23. Not a call. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which was itself information. Unknown numbers didn't reach her personal phone by accident. Her contact protocols weren't publicly accessible. Someone had gone through channels she'd thought were closed. The text was 4 words. He filed for revocation. She sat with that for a moment. Then she typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under a minute. Someone who was at Harbor Ridge today. "You didn't see me. That was intentional." Emily stood up from the couch. She moved to the window out of habit, checking the street, reading the cars, identifying what was different from the baseline. It was a reflex she'd never managed to turn off, and at this point had stopped trying. "What do you want?" she typed. "To tell you that the situation is larger than Cole and a suspended nursing license, and that moving against you was a mistake he made for reasons that have nothing to do with your clinical record." She stared at the screen. "How large?" she typed. The response took longer this time, long enough that she almost sent a follow-up. Then, large enough that the people who need to know already know, and that what happens next at Harbor Ridge is going to be significantly different from what Cole is expecting. Emily read this message twice. She set the phone down on the counter and stood in her kitchen looking at nothing, doing the arithmetic again, faster this time, because the variables had just shifted. She had spent 4 years making herself small, making herself invisible, choosing, deliberately, a version of herself that didn't take up too much space, didn't draw too much attention, didn't reach back toward the thing she'd been before. She picked the phone back up. "When?" she typed. The response came immediately, as if it had been waiting. "They're already on their way." Emily didn't sleep. She lay on top of the covers with her clothes on and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew in the order she knew it, which was a habit she'd developed a long time ago in places where the cost of missing a detail was not something she could afford to calculate afterward. By 2 in the morning, she had a reasonable map of the situation. By 3:30, she had stopped trying to fill in the gaps she couldn't fill and had started doing the only thing available to her, which was wait with her eyes open. At 5:15, she got up, made coffee, and stood at the window watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale orange that Phoenix produced in early morning, which was one of the few things about this city she had allowed herself to actually like. She thought about the word they. They're already on their way. She'd spent 4 years refusing to think about who they might be in any given situation. She'd spent 4 years making they irrelevant to her life by keeping her life small enough that nobody needed to come for her. She'd done a reasonable job of it until Nathan Cole had decided she was a problem worth solving. She drank her coffee. She checked her phone. No new messages from the unknown number. She was ready when the knock came at 7:04. There were 2 of them. A woman and a man, both in civilian clothes that said federal in the same way that certain haircuts say military, not explicitly, but without ambiguity. The woman was 40-something, brown hair cut short, a demeanor that projected patience in the way of someone who used patience as a tool. The man was younger, early 30s, and held a leather credential case open before Emily had finished opening the door. "Ms. Carter," the woman said. "My name is Special Agent Devora Marsh. This is Agent Tully. We'd like to speak with you inside if that's possible." Emily looked at the credentials, looked at their faces, stepped back and let them in. They sat in her living room, agents on the couch, Emily in the chair across from them, and Marsh set a thin folder on the coffee table between them and left it closed. "We're not here about your suspension," Marsh said. "We want to be clear about that up front." "Then what are you here about?" Emily asked. "Nathan Cole." Marsh watched her. "And what he's been doing with information he's obtained about former military medical personnel." The room was quiet. Emily kept her face where she'd put it. "How much do you know about what he's been doing?" Marsh asked. "Nothing specific," Emily said. "I know the background check he ran on me used a service that shouldn't have had access to what they were querying." "That's accurate." Marsh opened the folder. She turned it so Emily could see the top page, a document that was substantially redacted, but whose header was visible. Defense Intelligence. Cole has been identifying former combat medical specialists who've transitioned into civilian roles, cross-referencing their locations, their employers, their current identities in some cases. He's been doing this for approximately 22 months. Emily looked at the document, and passing the information. To whom we haven't fully established. We know the endpoint is foreign. We know it's state-adjacent. meaning not a government agency directly, but an entity with government backing. Marsh's voice was even. The individuals he's identified are people whose operational histories in enemy hands could be used for targeting, for leverage, or for recruitment through coercion. The word targeting landed in Emily's chest the way she'd known it would land, heavy and specific, with the particular weight of a word that she had spent 4 years trying to make theoretical. "How many people?" she asked. 11 confirmed. We believe more." "And me?" "He queried your sealed record 10 days ago. The query was denied but logged." Marsh paused. "You were next on his list, Ms. Carter. Or Captain Rains." It was the first time anyone had said that name in 4 years. Emily sat with it. "The suspension," she said. "He suspended me because the query flagged. We believe he got nervous when he hit the seal and moved to neutralize you through institutional channels rather than risk further exposure. He likely assumed that if your license was revoked and you were professionally discredited, any information you had about his activities would be less credible, and you'd have more pressing personal concerns than reporting suspicious behavior." Emily thought about Marcus Greer, about Roseanne's face in the coffee shop, about the efficiency with which the hospital system had processed her removal once Nathan had applied sufficient pressure. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Marsh looked at her steadily. "Right now, nothing operationally. We need you to know the situation so you're not moving blind, and we need you to sit tight for approximately 48 hours while we finish building the case architecture." 48 hours. "We're close. We've been close for a while. Your situation accelerated the timeline." Emily looked at the folder, then at Marsh. "Is there a military component to this?" Marsh and Tully exchanged a brief look that was not long enough to be a full conversation, but was longer than nothing. "There's someone who will be coming to Harbor Ridge as part of the action phase," Marsh said. "I'd rather let him speak for himself." "Warren Keel," Emily said. This time, the look between them lasted longer. "You've met him," Marsh said. "I've worked adjacent to him, twice." Emily leaned back in her chair. "He's been watching the hospital." "He texted you last night," Marsh said. It wasn't a question. "Unknown number." "That's him," Marsh said, without elaboration. Emily processed this. Keel was here, Marsh's team was here, and the 48-hour window meant they were waiting on something. A warrant, a final piece of evidence, a coordinated action that required precise timing. She'd been part of enough operations to recognize a holding pattern. "The 11 people he identified," Emily said. "Are they safe?" "We've made contact with all confirmed individuals," Marsh said. "Appropriate precautions are in place." Appropriate precautions. The language of people who wanted to sound reassuring without making promises. Emily recognized that too. "All right," she said. 48 hours. Marsh stood. She picked up the folder. "Don't contact the hospital. Don't contact Cole. If anything changes in your immediate environment, anything that feels off, use this." She set a card on the coffee table. "Just a phone number, no name. Any time of day." They left. Emily sat in the chair after the door closed and looked at the card for a long moment. Then she got up, rinsed her coffee mug, and did the only useful thing available to her in this moment. She went back to bed and slept for 4 hours, because she'd learned a long time ago to rest when resting was possible, since it frequently wasn't. Nathan Cole arrived at Harbor Ridge at 7:45 that morning, looking like a man running slightly ahead of something. He'd slept badly. The text from his contact, it flagged. "Someone knows you ran it," had sat in his nervous system all night, metabolizing into a low-grade nausea he couldn't shake. He told himself, during the 3 a.m. ceiling staring session that seemed to be a theme this week, that the flagged query didn't necessarily mean what it might mean. Queries got flagged all the time for a dozen procedural reasons. It didn't mean someone was actively looking at him. It didn't mean 18 months of careful, compartmentalized work was unwinding. He ran the morning briefing. He reviewed overnight cases. He answered emails with the specific efficient energy of someone performing normalcy, which he'd gotten good at. He stopped by Trauma 2 to check on a complex case from the overnight shift, asked sharp questions, nodded at the answers, moved on. By 10 a.m., he'd almost convinced himself he was fine. At 10:17, Gerald Foss called him into the administrator's office. Gerald Foss's office was on the second floor, away from the ER noise, and it smelled like the particular blend of carpet cleaner and old coffee that Nathan associated with uncomfortable conversations. Gerald was behind his desk, and there was another man in the room, seated in the chair to the right, not behind anything, just present, who Nathan didn't recognize. "Nathan," Gerald said. His voice had the careful flatness of someone who'd been coached on what to say. "This is Dr. Raymond Sturch. He's with the hospital system's Regional Oversight Board." Sturch was in his 60s, gray suit, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at Nathan the way institutional officials look at people they've already decided about. "Sit down, Dr. Cole," Sturch said. Nathan sat. "There are some questions about the credentialing process for one of your nursing staff," Sturch said. "Specifically about the sequence of events leading to the suspension and the subsequent email requesting expedited license revocation." Nathan kept his expression calibrated. "I've been concerned about credential fraud. The committee's findings were inconclusive," Sturch said, without heat. "Not confirmatory. Your email characterized them as confirmatory." "My professional assessment. Your professional assessment superseded the committee's formal finding and requested a license revocation on that basis." Sturch's voice was even. "That's not how the process works, Dr. Cole. You know that." Nathan's jaw tightened. "The nurse in question has a background that doesn't withstand scrutiny." "That may or may not be the case," Sturch said. "The committee will determine that through proper process. What you did was attempt to accelerate an outcome before that process was complete." He looked at Gerald. "We're placing the revocation request on hold pending a full review. The committee will operate independently of ER administration for the remainder of this process." Gerald was looking at his desk, not at Nathan. "You're removing me from the review," Nathan said. "We're ensuring the review is conducted without procedural pressure from any single department director," Sturch said. "Yes," Nathan breathed. "This is standard administrative practice when there's a question of process integrity." Sturch stood, signaling the end of the meeting in the way of someone who'd been ending meetings since before Nathan was a resident. "We'll be in touch." Nathan walked out of Gerald's office and down the hall and into the stairwell, where he stood for a moment with his hand on the metal railing and his heart moving at a rate that his clinical brain automatically flagged as worth monitoring. Someone had gotten to the oversight board. Someone had moved faster than him. That didn't happen through routine administrative channels. That required either significant institutional pull or advanced knowledge that something was coming. He took out his phone and typed to the contact number. Level of exposure? Need to know now. The response took 11 minutes, which was longer than usual, and therefore its own kind of information. When it came, it said, "Don't contact again. Sit still." Nathan stared at that. "Don't contact again." After 22 months of a relationship that had run on regular, disciplined communication, silence was the instruction, which meant the people on the other end were either already gone or already caught. He put his phone in his pocket and walked back to the ER and resumed doing his job, because what else was there to do, and because the act of doing his job was the only performance of normalcy still available to him, and because Nathan Cole, whatever else he was, had never been someone who fell apart in public. He would figure this out. He had always figured things out. He did not figure out that 2 federal agents were at that moment in the hospital's IT department with a warrant, imaging his work computer and the server logs attached to his hospital credentials. Rosanne Teal noticed the IT people. She noticed them because Rosanne Teal noticed everything, and because 2 people arriving in the IT department with something that looked like legal documentation and an attitude of quiet urgency during a Thursday morning was not a normal event in her experience of Harbor Ridge. She didn't say anything about it. She filed it in the part of her brain that kept track of things that might matter later, and she went back to work. What she couldn't stop thinking about was Emily. At noon, she pulled out her phone and composed a text she immediately deleted, then composed another one and deleted that too. Then typed simply, "Something's happening here. I don't know what. Are you okay?" Emily's response came back in under 2 minutes. "Yes. Stay out of the way today if you can." Rosanne stared at that for a long moment. Stay out of the way was not a sentence innocent people wrote to colleagues about nothing. It was the sentence of someone who knew what was coming and was trying to protect the people adjacent to it. Rosanne put her phone away and went to find Dolores. "I need you to be aware of something," she said quietly, in the supply closet, which was the only reliably private space in the department. "I don't know specifics. but I think today might get complicated. Dolores looked at her with the expression of someone who had been nursing for 26 years and had a well-calibrated threshold for complicated. How complicated? I genuinely don't know, Roseanne said. Is it a patient situation or an administrative situation? Administrative, I think. Dolores was quiet for a moment. You think it's about Carter? I think it's about more than Carter, Roseanne said. But yes. Dolores absorbed this. All right, she said finally. I'll tell the charge nurses to keep the shift running clean and stay out of admin's business today. That's probably the right call, Roseanne said. They went back to work. The ER continued. Cases, patients, the ordinary emergency of a hospital afternoon. And underneath all of it, the quiet machinery of what was actually happening moved forward at its own pace, indifferent to the hospital's rhythms. The van arrived at Harbor Ridge's service entrance at 2:47 p.m. It was unmarked, which was notable only if you were paying close attention to the service entrance, which most people weren't. Two men got out and went in through the loading dock entrance with the confidence of people who had clearance they hadn't asked for. Warren Keel came in through the main entrance at the same time, wearing a suit that was not expensive but was pressed and carrying nothing. He walked to the reception desk, showed identification that he put away quickly, and was directed toward the administrative wing. He passed through the ER on his way there. He walked at a normal pace. He looked at nothing with particular intensity, but his eyes moved the way Emily's eyes moved, cataloging the room and the time it took to cross it, registering the nurse's station, the trauma bays, the charge desk, the positions of people in the hallway. Roseanne saw him. She didn't know why he registered. He looked like an administrator, unremarkable in the particular way of people trained to be unremarkable. But something about the way he moved made her watch him until he turned the corner. She went back to her chart. In Gerald Foss's office, which was becoming a busy room, Devorah Marsh was already seated when Keel arrived. There was also a woman Nathan didn't know, who turned out to be an assistant U.S. attorney named Waverly, who had the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for this meeting to happen for a long time. Gerald Foss was behind his desk. He looked like a man who had been briefed on several things in a short period of time and was managing his response to that with variable success. Dr. Cole is on shift, Keel said, without preamble. How do you want to handle notification? We wait until the IT imaging is complete, Marsh said. We have 40 minutes, maybe 50. And the arrest? Waverly asked. On hospital grounds is fine. We have the warrant. Marsh looked at Keel. You want to be there? Yes, Keel said. It came out flat and unambiguous. Waverly looked at her folder. The charges as filed are conspiracy, unauthorized access to protected personnel records, and transfer of classified information to a foreign entity. The espionage charge is pending the forensic review. We expect the imaging to support it, but we're not going in with it today. That's enough, Keel said. It was. It was more than enough. Gerald Foss cleared his throat. He looked like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure what the appropriate thing was, which was fair because there wasn't an appropriate thing. His ER director was about to be arrested in his hospital. Nothing in healthcare administration training covered the etiquette of that. The staff, Gerald said finally. The patients. We'll move quickly, Marsh said. We're not doing this in the middle of the ER. At 3:22, Nathan Cole was in his office reviewing a patient transfer request when his door opened without a knock. He looked up. 3 people he didn't know walked in, and one he did. The woman who'd been in Gerald's office this morning, the regional oversight figure, except now she wasn't performing that role, and her expression was different from before. And everything about this moment had a texture that Nathan's nervous system understood before his conscious mind caught up. Dr. Cole, Devorah Marsh said, showing him credentials that said FBI. I need you to set your phone on the desk and put your hands where I can see them. Nathan went very still. Your phone, she said again, on the desk. He placed it down. His hands were steady. He'd spent a long time being good at this, at maintaining the surface while everything underneath was moving in a different direction entirely. What is this? He said. This is a federal arrest, Dr. Cole. You're being charged with unauthorized access to protected military personnel records, conspiracy, and transfer of classified information to a foreign entity. Marsh moved around the desk. Please stand. He stood. His mind was running, fast, in several directions simultaneously, and landing nowhere useful. The contact was gone, the IT team had been in his office, and the woman from the oversight board was actually FBI. 22 months, and it had ended on a Thursday afternoon in his own office with the ER running 2 floors below him. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Marsh said. "We'll arrange that." She turned him toward the door. Warren Keel was standing in the doorway. Nathan looked at him. Keel looked back. There was no anger in Keel's expression, which was somehow worse than anger. It was the look of someone who had finished something and was clear-eyed about what that meant. "You had no idea what you were reaching into," Keel said. "That's the part that's going to bother you. You never knew who she was." Nathan said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be used against him, and he was smart enough to know it. Marsh moved him through the doorway. Keel stepped aside. The hallway was empty. Marsh had timed it well. Between patient transfers, staff positioned away from the route. They moved Nathan through the administrative wing and out through a side exit that opened into the parking structure, where a vehicle was waiting. He didn't look back at the building. He didn't look back at anything. At 3:31, Emily's phone rang. She was in her car, in a parking garage 6 blocks from the hospital, because 48 hours had turned into 36, and she'd been unable to make herself stay in the apartment once the afternoon started. She hadn't gone to the hospital. She just needed to be closer without being inside. She answered. "It's done," Marsh said. "Cole is in custody. The forensic imaging confirmed the charges. We'll have more for the filing by end of business today." Emily breathed once, slow. "The other 11. All contacts are confirmed safe. You'll be officially briefed in the next 48 hours about the full scope." My suspension. Gerald Foss has been informed of the situation. The suspension will be formally reversed pending what we expect to be a brief administrative process. Marsh paused. "Captain Rains, the record seal is going to be partially lifted, not publicly, but enough that the relevant people at the hospital will understand what they were dealing with." Emily looked out through the windshield at the concrete levels of the parking structure. "There's someone who wants to speak to you in person," Marsh said. "Tomorrow morning, Warren Keel." "I know," Emily said. "He said you'd say that." A brief pause. "You should know that when we executed the warrant and went through Cole's files, the depth of what he found on some of the 11 individuals was significant. Operational histories, locations, family information in some cases." Emily went quiet. She knew what family information meant. She knew what it would have meant if that information had reached whatever foreign entity Cole was passing it to. She knew what the 11 people on that list would have faced. "How close was he to completing his profiling on me?" she asked. "Close enough," Marsh said. "The seal held, but he had your current alias, your employer, your address." The address. Her apartment. The window she'd stood at this morning, watching the sky go pale. "You're clear now," Marsh said. "But you should know." "I know," Emily said. "I know how close that was." After the call ended, she sat in the car for a while, not moving, not thinking in any ordered way, just sitting with the particular unwinding of sustained tension that didn't feel like relief so much as gravity returning to normal after a long time of compensating for its absence. She thought about the 11 names in Cole's files. People who had done what she'd done, built lives out of reach of what they used to be, gotten up every morning and been someone ordinary in a world that had no idea what that ordinariness cost them. She thought about Marcus Greer breathing normally after a chest tube that took 90 seconds. She thought about Roseanne's face saying she saved someone's life, flat and factual, as if that were the argument and it ought to be enough. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed again. Not a call. A text from Roseanne. "ER just got the weirdest memo about ongoing administrative developments. Half the floor thinks we're being acquired. Dolores thinks it's budget cuts. What do you know?" Emily almost smiled. She typed back, "Tell Dolores she's wrong. She's going to want more than that." "Tomorrow," Emily typed. "I'll explain tomorrow." She started the car. She pulled out of the parking structure into the late afternoon Phoenix light, which hit the buildings at an angle that made everything look briefly like it was made of copper. Tomorrow, she would go back. Tomorrow, Keel would tell her whatever he'd come to say, and the formal process would begin, and she would walk back through the doors of Harbor Ridge Medical Center as something different from what she'd been when she walked out. But she hadn't arrived at tomorrow yet. She was here, in the now, in a car moving through ordinary traffic, and Nathan Cole was in federal custody, and the sealed record that had kept her safe for 4 years had held long enough, and the network of information he'd been feeding had been cut at its source. She stopped at a red light. The car next to her had music playing loud enough to be audible through 2 layers of glass. The driver was singing along badly, without apparent concern for who might notice. Emily watched him for the duration of the red light. Then the light changed, and she drove, and she let herself think about what it might mean to stop making herself invisible, what it might mean to stop bracing for the moment someone figured out what she was. The thought was so unfamiliar that it took most of the drive home before she could hold it steadily. She was pulling into her parking lot, reaching for her key, when her phone rang again. Not Marsh, not Roseanne, not a number she recognized, a different unknown, and something in the pattern made her answer before the second ring instead of letting it go. The voice on the other end was not Keel. It was a man she didn't recognize, speaking fast and low. "We need you to listen very carefully because we have approximately 4 minutes before this line is traced, and we need you to understand that Cole was not operating alone, and the arrest today has not closed the exposure, and there are people who know where you live who have not been picked up, and you need to move right now." Emily's hand was already on the door handle, key out, eyes scanning the parking lot in the 3 seconds it took her to process the sentence. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone on your side," the man said. "But that doesn't matter right now. What matters is the car parked 2 rows behind yours has been there since 11 this morning, and the occupant has not moved in 4 hours, and you need to not go toward your apartment." Emily's eyes found the car. Dark sedan. 2 rows back, left side. She could see the silhouette of someone behind the wheel. She didn't look at the car again. One look was enough. She'd clocked the make, the color, the plate angle, the position of the silhouette, all of it processed in under 2 seconds and filed. Looking again would signal awareness, and signaling awareness would close her window. "How do you know this?" she said into the phone. Her voice was level. She was already doing the math on the parking lot. Entry points, sight lines, which direction put the most structural obstruction between her and the sedan. "Because I've been watching the same people Cole was working for, from the other direction," the man said. "My name is Aldrich Souza. I work for an agency that coordinates with Keel's office but does not report to it. I've been embedded in the network Cole was feeding for 7 months. You're inside." Was inside. Cole's arrest blew the operation 4 hours early. They knew within 90 minutes that he was in custody. They moved within the hour. A pause. The person in that car was supposed to be surveillance only. The instruction set may have changed. Emily walked toward the building entrance at a completely normal pace, as though she were going to her apartment. She did not go toward her apartment. She went through the lobby, through the exit on the opposite side, and into the narrow service alley that ran between her building and the parking structure. "What's the instruction set if it changed?" she asked. "Either contain you until they get assets out of the country, or remove the exposure entirely." Remove the exposure. She'd used that phrase herself once, in a different context, in a different life, and she knew exactly what it meant. "Marsh," she said. "Can't reach her fast enough. She's with Cole's transport. Field communication on federal arrests goes through channels that take time." "Keel." "Try Keel," Souza said. "But move while you dial. Don't stop moving." She was already moving. The alley ran east, came out on a cross street 3 buildings down. She went east, fast, not running. Running draws attention. Running gets remembered. But moving at the edge of fast, the pace she'd learned in places where the ground had been uncertain and the cost of hesitation had been immediate. She pulled up Keel's number from the card Marsh had given her. He picked up on the second ring. "I have a problem," she said. "I know," Keel said. "Souza called me 30 seconds ago. Where are you?" "Service alley east of my building, coming out on Caldwell." "Keep going east. There's a gas station 2 blocks up on the right. Go inside. I'll have someone to you in 8 minutes. Souza says the surveillance posture may have escalated." "I know what Souza says." A brief pause. "Emily, 8 minutes." She came out of the alley onto Caldwell Street and turned east without breaking stride. The city moved around her. Late afternoon traffic, pedestrians, a food truck with a line of 3 people, the ordinary texture of a Thursday in Phoenix that had no idea what was happening inside it. She moved through all of it and felt the specific calibration that used to come in automatically and had been dormant for 4 years, settling back into place like a dislocated joint, reducing. She didn't like how natural it felt. She also didn't have time to think about that. The gas station had an attached convenience store. She went inside and positioned herself in the back, near the cooler section, facing the door. She could see the street through the plate glass front. She could see 3 different exit options. She bought a bottle of water she didn't drink and stood where she was and counted minutes. The car that pulled up at 7 minutes and 50 seconds was not a government vehicle in any obvious sense. It was a gray pickup, the kind of truck that Arizona produces in quantity and that draws no particular attention. The driver was a woman in her 30s, military bearing under civilian clothes, who came inside, looked at Emily directly, and said, "Keel sent me," with zero preamble. Her name was Carver, which might have been a first name or a last name, and she didn't clarify. She drove without talking, which Emily appreciated, and they were 3 miles from the gas station before Carver said anything at all. "The sedan followed you into the alley," Carver said. "He lost you when you came out east. He went north. That bought us the window." Is Sousa's read accurate, that the instruction set may have escalated? We don't know yet. Sousa is trying to confirm through a secondary contact inside the network. Carver's eyes moved between the road and the mirrors with the automatic rhythm of someone who did this without thinking. Keel thinks it's 60-40 surveillance. They want to know where you go, not pick you up. But 60-40 is not a comfortable margin. No, Emily said, it isn't. We're taking you to a staging location. Keel will meet you there. Emily looked out the window at Phoenix going by. Her apartment was behind her. Her carefully constructed, deliberately ordinary life was behind her. She'd known, somewhere under the level where she let herself think clearly about things, that it was always temporary, that you couldn't bury something deep enough that the right dig couldn't find it. You could only buy time and use the time well and be ready when it ran out. "The other 10 people on Cole's list," she said. "The network knows Cole is arrested. They'll move to neutralize their exposure." Carver was quiet for a beat. "That's already in process. Keel's team has been coordinating rapid notification since 2 hours ago." "All 11 confirmed?" 9 confirmed safe, 2 unreachable as of 40 minutes ago. Active effort. Emily absorbed this. 2 unreachable. 2 people somewhere in the country who had done what she'd done. Built a life. Made themselves ordinary. Put distance between themselves and the thing they used to be. And who might right now be sitting in a parking lot getting a phone call from someone they didn't know. Or might not be getting a call at all. "Which 2?" she asked. "I can't give you that." She didn't push. It wouldn't change anything she could do from a moving truck in Phoenix traffic. She watched the city, and she breathed, and she thought about what came next, because thinking about what came next was more useful than thinking about what she couldn't control. The staging location was a commercial suite in an unremarkable office building in Scottsdale, the kind of space that looks, from the outside, like it belongs to a small consulting firm, and on paper does. Inside, it was sparse and functional, with equipment that didn't belong to any consulting firm. Keel was there when she arrived. He looked, in person, like she remembered. Older now by 4 years. The silver more complete, but with the same quality of stillness she associated with people who had spent a long time in situations where stillness was a survival skill. He was standing at a table looking at something on a screen, and he looked up when she came in, and the thing that crossed his face was not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. "You're okay," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He gestured to the chair across the table from him. She sat. He stayed standing, which she understood. Standing was a way of managing the energy that came from situations like this, and Keel had always been someone who managed his energy carefully. "Sousa's secondary contact confirmed 30 minutes ago," Keel said. "The instruction for the sedan was surveillance. They wanted to know if you ran and where you ran to, so they could assess how much you knew and whether you were a threat to their remaining assets. So not an escalation. Not yet. That could change depending on what they think we have." He paused. "The 2 unreachable individuals. One has been located. She was camping in a dead zone area in New Mexico. No cell signal. She's been notified and is with our people now." "The other?" Keel's expression shifted slightly. "We're still working on that. One person, somewhere, with a file in a network that now knew its pipeline had been cut and was assessing damage." "What's the status of the network itself?" Emily asked. "Cole was one node. What did the forensic imaging tell you?" "More than we hoped, less than we need." Keel sat down across from her finally, which meant the news was going to take more than 30 seconds. Cole was a collection point, not a coordinator. He gathered and transmitted. He wasn't in contact with the top of the structure, and the people he was in contact with are layers removed from the actual decision makers. Keel put his hands flat on the table. The arrest matters. The intelligence from the imaging matters. But this doesn't end with Cole. Emily had expected this. She'd suspected it the moment Marsh used the word entity instead of naming a specific organization. Networks with the resources to run an 18-month collection operation on former military medical personnel didn't dissolve because one node got arrested. "How does it end?" she asked. Keel looked at her for a moment. "That's partly what I came to Phoenix to discuss with you." She waited. "There's a gap in what we recovered from Cole's files. He had 11 individuals profiled to varying degrees of depth. Yours was incomplete because of the SEAL. 3 others have significant gaps. Either Cole didn't finish the profiling or the data transfer was interrupted." Keel's voice was precise, measured. "The network will try to fill those gaps through other channels before they go dark. We have a window, short, to use that predictable behavior to trace the endpoint." "You want to let them try to fill the gaps," Emily said. "We want to make it look like one of the gaps is accessible." He met her eyes. "You understand what I'm asking?" She understood. He was asking whether she would agree to function as a visible target, not unprotected, not reckless, but visible, in a way that would draw collection activity toward a channel that could be traced back to its source. She looked at the table between them for a moment. "For how long?" 72 hours, maybe less. Sousa has a direct line into the secondary communication structure. When they make contact with the access point we set up, he can trace it upstream in real time." "And my cover identity?" "Emily Carter stays intact. We'd actually reinforce it, make the records look slightly more accessible than they should be, so it looks like the SEAL fraying under pressure rather than a deliberate opening." "The hospital," she said. "I need to go back." Keel nodded slowly. "The suspension reversal is in motion. Gerald Foss will have the formal documentation by tomorrow morning. Returning to work immediately actually supports the cover. It's exactly what someone who'd just been vindicated would do, and it gives you a plausible reason to be accessible and observable." Emily thought about the ER, about trauma 1 through 4 on the East Hall, about the crash carts checked every morning at 6, about Marcus Greer's color coming back while his saturation climbed. "All right," she said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. Then, "The one person still unreachable. Has the network had enough time to—" "We don't think so," Keel said. "But we don't know." She nodded. She didn't push. Keel would tell her if there was something she needed to know, and the rest she would have to let sit in the category of things she couldn't do anything about from this room. "Get some sleep," Keel said. "We have a safe house 2 blocks from here. You'll be back at Harbor Ridge by 8 a.m. "Keel," she said before she stood. He looked at her. "Cole's files. Was there anything in them that suggested he knew what I did specifically, operationally?" Keel was quiet for a moment. He knew the SEAL indicated a classified operational history. He knew your reflexes and clinical skills were inconsistent with your cover background. He suspected former combat medical personnel. He paused. He didn't know which operations. He didn't know the scope. If he had gotten past the SEAL, he'd have known enough to make you very valuable to the people he was passing information to. Keel held her gaze. "Which is why the SEAL matters, and why what you did for 4 years, keeping your head down, not making noise, mattered. You bought time." She stood. She picked up the water bottle she'd carried from the gas station and still hadn't drunk and set it on the table. "I'll be ready at 7, she said, and went to find the room she was going to sleep in. At Harbor Ridge Medical Center, Thursday evening ran its usual course. Roseanne Teal finished her shift at 7 and didn't go home immediately. She sat in the parking lot in her car and looked at her phone and the text from Emily. "Tomorrow. I'll explain tomorrow." And thought about the IT people she'd seen, and the memo about administrative developments, and the absence of Nathan Cole from the latter half of his shift, which had been covered by a physician who'd arrived without explanation and said almost nothing about where Cole was. She was not a person who speculated wildly. She was a person who observed and waited and formed conclusions on evidence. But even with her natural restraint, the shape of what she was looking at was becoming difficult to mistake. She drove home. She cooked dinner she mostly ate. She went to bed earlier than usual and lay there thinking about a blonde nurse who caught things without looking and moved like she'd been somewhere the rest of them hadn't. In Gerald Foss's office, the administrator was on his fourth call of the evening with the hospital's legal team, navigating the particular complexity of an ER director arrest and the institutional liability exposure it created. He was trying to be useful and mostly achieving the appearance of being useful. He had signed 3 documents and been told to expect 3 more by morning. At some point around 9 p.m., he allowed himself to think about Emily Carter, the process he'd approved, the suspension letter he'd authorized, the way she had stood at the nurse's station and read the letter and signed the form without a word and walked out through the ambulance bay. He thought about this for a while. Then he drafted an email to his legal team adding an item to the morning agenda: formal reversal of suspension and personnel file correction. He sent it and closed his laptop and felt slightly better, which was probably less than he deserved to feel, but it was something. Emily was back at Harbor Ridge by 7:58 the next morning. She came in through the main entrance, which she'd never used before. She'd always come in through the ambulance bay entrance, the working entrance, the entrance of someone who was showing up to do a job. The main entrance felt different, deliberate. She was aware of this and moved through it anyway. Gerald Foss met her in the lobby, which she hadn't expected. He was a tall man whose height didn't translate into presence the way it might have, and this morning he looked like someone who had not slept enough and knew it. He was holding a folder. "Ms. Carter," he said, then correcting something in himself. "Emily, I wanted to give you this in person." The folder contained the formal reversal of her suspension, the withdrawal of the credentialing committee's review, and a letter of apology from the hospital that had clearly been drafted by legal but carried his signature. She read it standing in the lobby. It was 4 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph was the one that mattered. It acknowledged that the suspension had been initiated under circumstances that subsequent investigation had revealed to be improper, and that her clinical record at Harbor Ridge Medical Center was without deficiency. She closed the folder. "Thank you," she said. Gerald looked like he wanted to say more. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I should have looked more carefully at the process," he said. "Before I authorized it. I moved too fast and I should have—" "Gerald," she said. Not unkindly. "I'm going to go to work." He nodded. He stepped aside. She went through the ER doors and they swung open ahead of her, and the familiar smell hit: antiseptic, coffee that had been sitting too long, the background mechanical hum of a department in motion. And she was suddenly, simply back. Roseanne was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Emily came through the doors. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're early." "Shift starts at 8, Emily said. "Your shift starts at 8. Most people show up late after being out for 2 weeks." "I'm not most people," Emily said. Roseanne looked at her for another moment, taking in something, measuring something, doing the calculation of a 13-year nurse who had seen most things and knew how to read what people didn't say. Then she said, "I'll get you a chart." "I know where they are," Emily said. "I know you do," Roseanne said, and for the first time in 2 weeks, something in the ER felt like it had been adjusted back to where it belonged. The morning ran fast. A pediatric asthma case, a construction worker with a crush injury, 2 overdoses in rapid succession that required the kind of sustained, controlled focus that left no room for anything peripheral, an elderly woman with a hip fracture who spoke very little English and was frightened and needed someone to sit with her for 8 minutes while her daughter was located. Emily sat with her for 8 minutes. She held the woman's hand, which was dry and light and trembling slightly, and spoke to her quietly in the limited way that doesn't require shared language, tone, presence, contact. The woman's breathing slowed. Priya Suresh found Emily between cases at 10:40 in the hallway outside Trauma 2. "You came back," Priya said. "I came back," Emily said. Priya looked at her the way she'd looked at her across the gurney when Marcus Greer's color had returned. Directly, taking stock, giving the moment its proper weight. "The Greer case. I documented it accurately." "I know," Emily said. "Thank you." "I didn't do it for—" Priya stopped, started again. "I documented it accurately because it was accurate, that's all." "That's enough," Emily said. "That's more than enough." Priya nodded. She went back to her patient. Emily went back to work. At 11:15, a federal agent Emily didn't recognize came through the ER looking for her. Not Marsh, not Carver. A younger man in a jacket that was too warm for Phoenix, carrying a tablet. He found her in the break room and showed her a document on the screen with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone delivering scheduled information. Cole's arraignment is at 2 p.m., he said quietly. Sousa's secondary access point went active 40 minutes ago. The trace is running. The 11th person, she said, still unreachable? He hesitated 1 second too long. Tell me, she said. We located him this morning, the agent said. He's okay. There was an approach made last night. He handled it. A pause. He has a background. Of course he did. They all did. That was the point. The trace, she said. 72 hours? At current activity level, Sousa thinks less, maybe 36. She nodded. He left. She stood in the break room for a moment, in the particular quiet that break rooms achieve mid-morning before the lunch rush, and thought about a network of people who had tried to make themselves ordinary and the system that had used that against them. And she felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was past anger, had been processed into something colder and more purposeful. She went back to the floor. At 2 p.m., Nathan Cole was arraigned in federal court in Phoenix. He entered a not guilty plea, which was expected. His attorney was already managing his public statement, which characterized the situation as a misunderstanding pending full investigation. His wife was not in the courtroom. His daughter was at school. The federal charges as filed were read aloud and included, by that afternoon, the espionage count that Marsh had said would follow the forensic review. The imaging of his work computer had delivered. The data transfer logs were there, encrypted, but not encrypted well enough to withstand the kind of analysis that federal resources could bring to bear over 48 hours. 18 months of Tuesday evenings. 18 months of careful, compartmentalized work. The courtroom was not full. These things rarely are at the arraignment stage. But the physician's professional network was a small and fast-moving organism, and by 4 p.m., Harbor Ridge's medical staff knew. And by 5 p.m., the Arizona Medical Board had initiated its own parallel review. Roseanne heard about the arraignment from Dolores, who heard it from someone in the administrative wing, who had seen it on a news alert. Roseanne went to find Emily. She was in Trauma 3 finishing documentation on the crush injury, which had required a surgical consult and a lengthy cascade of communications that Emily had managed with the systematic patients that Roseanne was now, finally, recognizing as something she'd seen before in very specific kinds of people. Cole was arraigned, Roseanne said. I know, Emily said. Espionage. I know. Roseanne stood in the doorway and looked at her. How long have you known? Emily didn't answer immediately. She finished the documentation note, reviewed it, closed the chart. Then she looked up at Roseanne. I'm going to tell you what I can tell you, Emily said. When I can tell you. Not everything, but what I can. She held Roseanne's gaze. Is that enough for now? Roseanne considered this. It was the most Emily had ever offered in a direct sentence, and they both knew it. For now, Roseanne said, ought. The next 30 hours moved in the strange doubled time of someone simultaneously doing ordinary work and waiting for something large to land. Emily moved through her shifts. She was present for 3 trauma cases, 2 of which were straightforward, and 1 of which involved a pediatric near drowning that required everything she had and left her when it was over and the child was stabilized and transferred, standing in the corridor outside Trauma 1 with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing deliberately even. Dolores appeared beside her. She didn't say anything. She handed Emily a cup of coffee that was slightly too hot and stood there while Emily drank it. Thank you, Emily said. It was a good catch on the fluid management, Dolores said, referring to a call Emily had made during the resuscitation that had gotten the team ahead of a developing complication. Priya said so. Priya did the work, Emily said. Priya said, Dolores repeated, in the precise and patient way of someone who was not going to let this get deflected. It was a good catch. Emily drank her coffee. At 6:15 on Saturday morning, Sousa called. The trace completed, he said. 31 hours. We have the endpoint. He sounded, for the first time in her experience of him, slightly less controlled than usual. It's significant. How significant? Significant enough that Keel is already on a plane. Significant enough that this is not a Phoenix operation anymore. He paused. Cole gets a lot worse before he gets better. The network he was feeding. We have the structure now. We have names. Emily was standing in the hospital parking lot, between her car and the building, the early Phoenix morning still cool enough to be bearable. The sky was going from black to purple to the edge of orange. Is my part done? She asked. Your part was done when the access point went active, Souza said. Everything after that was the trace running on its own. You were never in direct exposure. The sedan in my parking lot. That driver was picked up last night, Souza said, quietly. He's cooperating. She breathed once, slow and deliberate. Souza, she said. Who are you exactly? A brief pause. Someone who's been in a different kind of cover for 7 months, he said, and who is very ready to be out of it. Another pause. You should know. The 11th individual. The approach made to him last night. They used information that came from Cole's files. Partial information, because Cole's profiling was incomplete, but enough to find him. You said he handled it. He did, but it was close. Souza's voice was careful. If Cole had completed the profiling, if he'd gotten past the SEALs, the people on that list were not abstractions to the network. They were targets with potential operational value. The fact that you were all living ordinary lives was precisely the point. It made you accessible. Emily stood in the parking lot and looked at the building where she worked. The lights in the ER corridor were already on. Through the glass panels, she could see the beginning of morning activity, the shift change that happened regardless of everything else, the work continuing. I need to go in, she said. I know, Souza said. One more thing. She waited. Keel wanted me to tell you, and I'm quoting directly because he was specific about the wording, that the record will be corrected, not publicly. But in the systems that matter, your operational history will be properly attributed. The missions that weren't written up cleanly will be written up. What you did will be in the record. The sky was fully orange now, the way Phoenix mornings went, sudden and complete, no gradual transition, just dark and then light. Emily thought about a lot of things in the space of about 4 seconds. She thought about the woman she'd been before Emily Carter, and the things that woman had done in places that didn't have good lighting and didn't make the news and cost more than she'd been told they'd cost. She thought about what it meant to have those things exist in a record that would be read by exactly 4 people and never made public and would nonetheless be true. Okay, she said. She went inside. At 9:47 that morning, Warren Keel walked through the main entrance of Harbor Ridge Medical Center for the second time. And this time he didn't go to the administrative wing. He came directly to the ER, and he found Emily at the nurses' station, and the staff around them registered his presence as significant without knowing exactly why, the way you register a change in atmospheric pressure before you register weather. Keel looked at her. She looked at him. The network endpoint, she said quietly. You got there. We got there, he said. 41 people are being picked up across 3 countries in the next 6 hours. The Phoenix operation is clean. He paused. Cole's charges will be expanded by end of business today. His attorney is going to have a very difficult afternoon. Emily nodded. There's something else, Keel said. He had the tone of someone arriving at the thing they came to say. The hospital is going to want to formalize your position. Gerald Foss has been in contact with the board. They want to offer you something more than your previous role. I'm a floor nurse, she said. You're a former captain with a field trauma record that most attending physicians in this building couldn't match, Keel said. And you've spent 6 weeks demonstrating that in an ER that didn't know what it was watching. She looked at the department around her, Roseanne at the far end of the station, Dolores emerging from the supply corridor, Priya's voice audible from behind a trauma bay curtain, the sounds and rhythms of a place doing necessary work with imperfect tools and variable success. I'll hear what they want to offer, she said. That's all I'm committing to. That's all anyone's asking, Keel said. He stayed for another 40 minutes, during which he spoke with Gerald Foss and 2 hospital board members who had come in specifically for the conversation, and during which Emily treated a hypertensive crisis in trauma 4 and a hand laceration in the procedure room, and answered 3 questions from a first-year resident about pressure management in the context of fluid resuscitation, explaining the reasoning behind each decision with the specific practicality of someone who had worked out these principles in conditions far less forgiving than this one. The resident's name was Okonkwo. He was 27, smart, not as confident as he needed to be yet, and he listened in the particular way of someone who understood that the information was important even if he didn't know exactly why yet. "Where did you study?" he asked when she finished. Emily looked at him. "Here and there," she said. He nodded, accepting this, making a note on his tablet. She was pulling off her gloves from the laceration case when her phone buzzed with a message from Souza. "The 41st pickup just confirmed. Network is down. The one remaining unresolved file, the individual still being located, has been found safe, uncontacted." She read this twice. All 11 safe." She put the phone in her pocket. She went to the nurse's station and picked up the next chart, and she was reading it when Roseanne came up beside her and said, in the quiet tone she used when she was saying something she meant, "Whatever happened, and whatever you can't tell me, I'm glad you came back." Emily looked at the chart in her hands, then at Roseanne. "So am I," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in this building, and Roseanne received it simply, without making it larger than it was, which was exactly the right response. What Emily didn't say, couldn't yet, because the full shape of it hadn't resolved, was that the moment Keel had said the record will be corrected, something had shifted in the part of her that had been braced since before she'd become Emily Carter. Not healed, not fixed, but shifted. The way a door shifts when the pressure behind it finally equalizes so that it sits differently in its frame. She set down the chart when a radio from the ambulance bay crackled with incoming notification. 2 minutes out, mechanism unknown, vitals unstable, and she was already moving toward the bay when the second call came through, this one from the trauma coordinator, flagging a complication on a case in Trauma 2 that needed an experienced set of hands. 2 things at once. It was always 2 things at once. She split her attention cleanly, directed Okonkwo toward Trauma 2 with specific instructions and a look that communicated exactly how much latitude he had, and went to meet the ambulance herself. The bay doors opened. She was ready. What she didn't know yet, what no one in the building knew yet, except Warren Keel, who had just received a message on his phone and whose expression had changed in the controlled and significant way of someone getting news that changes the shape of an operation, was that among the 41 arrests being processed across 3 countries, one individual had given information during initial interrogation that suggested Cole's collection operation had a second arm, running parallel to the first, that had been targeting a category of personnel even more sensitive than former combat medics, and that 2 names on that second list were people Keel had worked with directly, and that one of those names was a woman he had just watched walk calmly toward an ambulance bay in a Phoenix hospital, and that the operation Emily thought was over was not, in fact, entirely over. The ambulance bay doors opened and the gurney came through fast. Male, mid-40s, construction fall, approximate 15 feet, no loss of consciousness reported but disoriented on scene. Right arm at an angle that told the story before anyone said a word. Emily moved. She got her hands on the patient before the paramedic finished the handoff report, doing a rapid sweep while the words were still coming. Airway clear, breathing present bilaterally, radial pulse right side weak and thready, pupils equal and reactive. The arm was bad, but it wasn't going to kill him. She was looking for what would kill him. He was talking fine at scene, the paramedic said. Started going quiet about 4 minutes out. Quiet was the wrong direction. Quiet meant something changing inside that the body hadn't announced yet. BP? She asked. 94/60 on scene. We couldn't get a second reading. Line blue. She looked at his abdomen. She pressed gently. 2 points. His face tightened even through the disorientation. Trauma 2, she said. Get Priya. They moved. Behind her, the bay doors were already opening for something else. The ER's basic indifference to any single event, the machine continuing while she focused on this one man whose name she didn't know yet, and whose internal landscape she was reading through her fingertips and his face, and the pattern of everything that was wrong. For 11 minutes, she didn't think about Keel, or the message on his phone, or the second arm of Cole's network, or her own name on any list anywhere. She thought about a man who had fallen 15 feet, and whose spleen was probably compromised, and whose pressure was dropping in the slow, determined way of internal hemorrhage that had not yet declared itself fully. Priya arrived at 2 minutes. The surgical consult was in by 5. The patient was moving to the OR at 9 minutes with a BP they'd managed back to 102 and an IV that had taken 3 attempts. Emily stripped her gloves in the hallway. Okonkwo appeared at her elbow, slightly breathless. "Trauma 2 is stable," he said. "I followed your instructions. Dr. Suresh reviewed and said to tell you the call on the fluid rate was correct." "Good," she said. He hesitated. "How did you know, with this patient, that it was the abdomen and not just the arm?" She looked at him. He was genuinely asking, not performing curiosity for an audience. "His arm hurt," she said. He knew his arm hurt, but his face was doing something else, something deeper, something he couldn't locate. When pain has a source people know, they move toward it. When they don't know the source, they go still. She pulled off the second glove. He went still. Okonkwo wrote something down. She watched him write it and felt, briefly, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of knowledge transferred, of something useful passing from one person to another, of information that had cost something becoming worth the cost. She was thinking about this, standing in the hallway with her back to the main corridor, when Keel's hand came briefly to her elbow, and he said, "Walk with me," in the quiet tone that meant now and not optional. So they went to the consultation room off the main corridor, small, windowless, used for family notifications and difficult conversations. Keel closed the door. He didn't sit. "The 41st arrest," he said. "The individual gave a statement during initial processing, partial, and we're verifying, but credible enough that I need to tell you in person." Emily waited. Cole wasn't the only collector. There was a parallel operation, same network, different handler, running alongside Cole for approximately 14 months. Different target profile. Not former combat medics specifically, former special operations personnel who transitioned into any civilian professional role. Keel's voice was precise and contained. "The second list is shorter, 7 names. 2 of them are people I know." "One of them is me," Emily said. "Yes." She absorbed this without moving. "How complete is the profiling on the second list?" The individual being processed doesn't have full visibility. He was a logistics node, not a data handler. What he knows is the list exists, the handler is separate from Cole's chain, and the operation was specifically targeting people with special operations backgrounds because the intel value is higher. Keel paused. "The handler has not been identified yet. The arrest sweep today covered Cole's network. The parallel network is a separate structure. So the 41 pickups today didn't touch it." "The 41 pickups today gave us the thread," Keel said. "We didn't know the parallel operation existed until 40 minutes ago." Emily sat down, which she hadn't planned to do. She sat because the calculation she was running required stillness. And the calculation was this: a handler she didn't know, operating from a structure that hadn't been touched by today's sweep, with a partial profile on her that had been built over 14 months, and a list of 6 other people in the same position. "The second list," she said. "The other 6. Have they been notified?" "In process. It's moving faster now because we know what to look for." Keel sat across from her. "Emily, the handler, based on the logistics node's description of communication patterns and the timing of information transfers, has been operating in Phoenix." The room was quiet. "How long?" she asked. "We don't know. The node only had partial information on geography." Keel's jaw was tight. "Souza is running a cross-reference now against Cole's known contacts in the Phoenix area. People Cole had direct personal relationships with, medical community, professional networks, social contacts." "Cole was the connection point," Emily said. "We think so. We think the handler recruited Cole and maintained contact, and that the Phoenix geography is tied to Cole's presence here." He met her eyes. "Which means the handler may have been watching Harbor Ridge. Not just the network, not just a data transfer somewhere abstract and distant. Here, this building. The ER she'd walked back into 2 days ago." Emily thought about the sedan in her parking lot. She thought about the driver who'd been quietly picked up and was cooperating. She thought about whether cooperating meant he'd given everything or everything he knew, which were not the same thing. "The sedan driver," she said. "Did he know about the parallel operation?" Keel's expression shifted. "We're asking him that question right now, sub." Souza arrived at Harbor Ridge 40 minutes later, which was faster than Emily had thought possible, and suggested he'd been closer than Scottsdale. He came through the service entrance, which meant someone had given him the code, which meant the coordination between his agency and Keel's had accelerated significantly in the last 2 hours. He was younger than she'd expected from his voice. Mid-30s, dark hair, the particular look of someone who had been operating under sustained stress for months and had metabolized it into a kind of controlled intensity. He and Keel shook hands in the way of people who trusted each other without necessarily liking each other. They set up in Gerald Foss's conference room because Gerald Foss was at this point doing whatever Warren Keel asked him to do, and what Keel asked for was a room with a door and a screen. Emily sat at the table. Keel and Sousa stood at the screen. The cross-reference Sousa had been running was on the display. Names, connection types, proximity indicators. 14 names in Cole's Phoenix social and professional network, Sousa said. We've cleared 11. 2 we're in the process of verifying. 1, he pointed to the screen, we cannot locate. The name on the screen was Dr. Martin Farr, former colleague of Cole's from his residency program 12 years ago, currently listed as a private medical consultant based in Phoenix, no hospital affiliation. What does a private medical consultant do? Emily asked. Technically, advises healthcare organizations on operational efficiency. Practically? Sousa looked at the screen. It's a category that requires almost no institutional oversight, generates significant income, and it involves contact with a wide range of medical professionals across multiple facilities. He'd have access to personnel information, Keel said, across multiple systems, legitimately. And Cole would have been a natural referral source, Sousa said. Medical community is small. If Cole was identifying targets inside the hospital, Farr could be cross-referencing against his own contact network to build complete profiles. Emily looked at the name. How long has he been unreachable? Since 8 this morning. His cell phone went dark. His office, virtual address, answering service. His residence is a rental, paid through a management company. Sousa's voice was even. He knew. Somehow he knew the sweep was happening. The room was quiet for a moment. He has my profile, Emily said. Partial, but 14 months of accumulation through Cole's collection and his own cross-referencing. He knows I'm back at the hospital. He knows I'm connected to Keel now, which means he knows his operation is exposed. Yes, Sousa said. So he's either running or he's trying to finish something before he runs. Neither Sousa nor Keel answered that directly, which was its own answer. Emily looked at the screen for another moment. Then she looked at Keel. What do you need me to do? Nothing operational, Keel said immediately. Keel. I mean it. You are not. I'm already inside this, she said. My name is on his list. Whatever Farr is trying to finish before he runs, I'm a variable in it. Keeping me in a conference room doesn't change that. She held his gaze. What do you need? Keel looked at Sousa. Sousa looked at the screen. Farr's last confirmed location was a parking structure near Camelback and 24th, Sousa said. 3 blocks from here. 3 blocks? His phone went dark at 8, Emily said. It's now 11:42. He's had 3 hours and 42 minutes in a 3-block radius. We don't know he stayed in the radius, Keel said. You don't know he left it, she said. What happened next was not elegant, and it was not the kind of thing that gets described cleanly afterward in reports, because the things that actually work rarely are. Sousa ran the parking structure's camera feeds through a contact at the city's traffic management center, which took 22 minutes. Keel coordinated with Marsh, who had finished Cole's transport and was back in Phoenix and moving. Emily went back to the ER because leaving the ER would have been the visible thing, the thing that changed the environment, and she had learned a long time ago that you don't change the environment when you're waiting for something to resolve. She treated a diabetic crisis and a facial laceration and answered Okonkwo's question about the laceration repair with the patience of someone who was simultaneously present and listening to a frequency he couldn't hear. At 12:51, Sousa sent a message. Camera feed. Parking structure. Level 3. He's still there. At 12:53, Keel's team moved. Emily was in the break room when she heard it. Not a commotion, because Keel's people didn't create commotions, but the particular quality of movement in the outer corridor that registers as different if you're calibrated for it. She stayed where she was. She drank the coffee she'd poured 20 minutes ago and hadn't touched. At 1:17, Keel came into the break room and sat down across from her and said, It's done. She looked at him. Farr was in the structure. He had materials with him, a laptop, documentation, what looks like a full exfiltration package. He was preparing to transfer the remaining files before he left the country. Keel's voice was measured, but something under it had released, the way tension releases when a load is finally set down. Marsh has him. He's not talking, but the materials will. Emily set down the coffee cup. The second list, she said, all 6 others. All confirmed, notified, and safe. Farr hadn't transmitted the complete profiles yet. He was trying to finish the package when we got to him. Keel paused. If he'd had another 3 hours. He didn't, Emily said. He didn't, Keel agreed. The break room was empty except for them. From beyond the door came the sounds of the ER. A PA announcement, a monitor alarm quickly silenced, the ordinary urgent life of the department continuing its work. Is this actually done? Emily asked. Keel considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. The Phoenix network is done. Cole's structure is down. The parallel operation is neutralized. The endpoint we traced through Sousa's access point gave us 3 additional connected cells that are being rolled up in the next 24 hours in separate operations. He looked at her directly. For your specific situation? Yes, it's done. She sat with that. Done was a word she'd stopped believing in for a while. Done implied an ending, and her experience of things was that they rarely ended so much as transformed, evolved, handed off their momentum to the next thing. But Keel was a precise man who chose his words carefully, and he'd said done, and she believed him. Okay, she said. There's going to be a formal debrief process, Keel said. Not immediately, over the next several weeks. Your cooperation has been noted, and it matters. The information from Sousa's trace, the window your return to the hospital created, the way you handled the sedan situation, it all goes into the record. The record that 4 people will read, she said. 5 now, he said. Marsh is thorough. Something in her chest did a complicated thing that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent. Keel, she said. The missions, the ones that weren't written up. He waited. There was a specific operation, she said, 3 years before I left. A field hospital situation in a location I'm not going to name. 4 soldiers who came in with injuries that should have been unsurvivable. We kept them alive through a 72-hour window with supplies that weren't designed for what we needed them for. She stopped, started again. The after-action report said 2 of them didn't make it. It was wrong. All 4 made it, but nobody corrected it. Keel was very still. I've known about that report, he said carefully. I want it corrected. It will be corrected, he said. I'll make sure of it personally. She nodded. She looked at the table. She thought about 4 soldiers who were alive somewhere in the world being listed in a document as not alive, and what that cost the people who loved them to read, and what it had cost her to carry, and what it would mean to have it fixed even if no one would ever see it except the people who needed to. Sometimes the record is the thing. Sometimes getting the record right is all you can do, and it turns out to be enough. Nathan Cole's formal sentencing came 11 weeks later. Emily wasn't in the courtroom. She didn't need to be. What she needed was delivered through the same channels that had delivered everything else in this story. A message from Marsh, factual and brief. Cole sentenced. 22-year federal. Espionage, conspiracy, unauthorized access classified records. No parole eligibility for 14 years. Medical license revoked permanently by Arizona board. 22 years. A man who had built his professional identity on being the smartest person in any room he entered, on being the one who defined the terms, on being the authority that other people positioned themselves relative to. 22 years in a federal facility, his medical license gone, his name now attached to a headline that would follow his daughter's Google searches for the rest of her childhood. Emily read the message once. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on a patient in post-procedure observation who was having more pain than expected. And she spent 35 minutes adjusting the pain management protocol and explaining to the patient's husband, who was frightened and asking too many questions, what was happening and why, and what the next few hours would look like. The husband said, when she finally stood to leave, "You're very calm. How are you so calm about all of this?" Emily looked at him. He wasn't really asking about her. He was asking how to be calm about his wife being in pain and him not being able to fix it, which was a different question. "You don't have to be calm," she said. "You just have to stay." He looked at her. His eyes went slightly wet, which he managed, barely. "Okay," he said. I'll check back in an hour, she said, and went back to the floor.
E.
The hospital board met formally in December, which was 9 weeks after Cole's arrest and 6 weeks after his sentencing, and the outcome of that meeting reached Emily through Gerald Foss, who asked if she had time to come upstairs on a Thursday afternoon. The offer on the table was the position of Trauma Education and Protocol Director, a new role created specifically designed to build advanced trauma training capacity within the ER and the wider hospital system. The role would keep her on the floor. It would also give her authority to design curriculum, to run simulations, to bring in outside expertise and export what Harbor Ridge was learning to other facilities in the system. It was not a management position in the way that takes people off the floor and into meeting rooms permanently. It was something more specific than that, a position designed for someone who knew how to do the thing and could teach others to do the thing, which was a more valuable skill set than it typically got credit for being. Gerald Foss presented this with the careful energy of someone who understood they were offering something that might not be accepted and was trying not to oversell it. "We want you to build something here," he said, "using what you know, however you know it." Emily looked at the offer letter on the table between them. It was 3 pages, which meant they'd had legal involved, which meant they were serious. "I have one condition," she said. Gerald waited. "Okonkwo," she said. "The first-year resident. I want him on the curriculum development team." Gerald blinked. "The resident." "He asks good questions," she said, "and he writes things down." Gerald made a note. "Done," he said. She picked up the offer letter. She read it properly, which took several minutes, because she was not someone who signed things she hadn't read. Gerald sat across from her and did not rush her, which she noted. She signed on the last page. Gerald extended his hand and she shook it, and his handshake was slightly too firm in the way of someone who was trying to convey sincerity through grip, which was a very human thing to do. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Let me work. That's it." The thing about starting over, actually starting over, not just moving to a new city and building a careful alias and making yourself small enough to survive, is that it requires a different kind of courage than the kind Emily had been practicing for 4 years. Survival courage is about compression, making yourself less, occupying less space, requiring less, expecting less, bracing for the impact that may or may not come. It's necessary and it's exhausting, and it becomes, if you do it long enough, indistinguishable from how you live. What she was doing now was the other kind. The first trauma training session ran on a Wednesday morning in January in the hospital's simulation center, which had equipment that was good but not as good as it needed to be, and which Emily had already submitted a budget request to upgrade. 12 participants, 4 nurses, 3 residents, 2 paramedics from the fire department who'd asked to be included, and 3 ER technicians who had been doing their jobs for years and had never had formal advanced trauma training. Emily ran the first scenario without preamble. She set up the simulation, blunt abdominal trauma, vitals degrading, limited information, and told them to go. They struggled, which was the point. You learn what you don't know fastest when the gap between what you thought you knew and what you actually know becomes visible and specific. She let it run for 4 minutes. Then she stopped them. "What did you miss?" she asked. Silence. "Not a trick question," she said. "What did you actually miss? Not what you should have done. What didn't you see?" Slowly they started talking. First one person, then 2, then the room was alive with the specific engaged discomfort of people who are learning something real. She didn't tell them she'd done this in places where missing it meant someone died. She didn't tell them about the 72-hour field hospital, or the 4 soldiers, or the supply constraints, or the particular quality of working at the edge of what was possible in conditions that didn't care what was possible. She told them what the indicators were. She told them what to look for, and how to look for it, and what to do with what they found. She told them in the specific and practical way of someone who had learned these things through repeated necessity, and she answered their questions without condescension and without drama. And at the end of 2 hours, the 12 people in the room knew things they hadn't known before, and she could see it in their faces. Okonkwo was in the corner with his tablet. He'd been writing the whole time. After the others filed out, she walked over to him. "How much did you get?" she asked. He looked at his notes. "Most of it. I missed some of the physiology logic on the hemorrhage sequence." "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. 6:30. I'll walk through it again. 6:30, he said, in the tone of someone making a note to set 2 alarms. Bring coffee, she said. He smiled, which was the first time she'd seen him do that without looking like it was a professional calculation. Yes, ma'am, he said. She let that one go. Rosanne Teal found Emily in the corridor after the session, which meant she'd been hovering, which was a very Roseanne thing to do. How'd it go? Roseanne asked. They missed the abdominal presentation for 4 minutes, Emily said. And? And next time they won't. Roseanne walked beside her for a moment in silence. Then, you're going to be here a while, aren't you? It wasn't quite a question. Emily thought about the offer letter she'd signed. She thought about Okonkwo's notes and the 12 people who'd left the simulation center knowing more than when they'd arrived. She thought about the budget request for the simulation equipment and the curriculum outline she'd been working on, which was currently 11 pages, and had notes in the margins from 3 separate late-night sessions. She thought about the record that had been corrected in a database that 5 people would ever access, and the 4 soldiers who were alive in the world and were now correctly listed as alive, and the specific quiet of knowing that was right, even though nothing visible had changed. She thought about who she'd been before Emily Carter, and who Emily Carter had become, and whether those 2 things were still separable or whether they had, somewhere in the last 3 months, fused into something that was just her. Not a cover, not a survival strategy, not a compressed version, just her, with all of it included, the before and the after and the in-between. Yes, she said, I'm going to be here a while. Roseanne nodded once, satisfied, and peeled off toward the nurse's station. Emily kept walking. Keel called on a Thursday evening in February. She was at home, at her kitchen table, with the curriculum outline in front of her and a cup of tea she'd been neglecting for an hour. The call lasted 12 minutes. The final count from the December sweep, 3 additional network cells dismantled across 2 countries. Cole's sentencing had triggered a cooperation cascade, the kind of thing that happens when institutional structures start to believe they're going down anyway, and individuals begin calculating the math of their own futures. Farr was cooperating in exchange for a reduced charge that his attorney had negotiated with the kind of deal-making that Emily found professionally repugnant and institutionally inevitable. The handler above Farr had been identified, located, and was being processed through a legal channel that didn't run through the American court system. All 11 individuals from Cole's original list had been formally notified that their exposure was resolved. The secondary list of 7 had been given the same notification. Emily was on both lists. The sealed record, Keel said. You should know that the classification review has been completed. The seal stands, but your operational history has been properly attributed in the appropriate internal systems. The 4 individuals from the field hospital situation, their records have been corrected. Emily set down her pen. All 4? She asked. All 4, he said. Correctly listed, alive and decorated. She looked at the table in front of her, the curriculum outline, 11 pages of notes on how to train people to keep other people alive. Thank you, she said. I should have done it 4 years ago, he said. The record should have been right. You shouldn't have carried that. She didn't argue with him about what she should or shouldn't have carried, because arguing about the past was a use of time she'd decided to stop making. But she noted it. She held it for what it was, which was an acknowledgement that came late and was still worth having. Keel, she said. Yes. I'm not coming back, she said, to that life. I want to be clear about that. A pause. I know. This is where I am now. I know that too, he said. And for what it's worth, what you're building there is going to save lives. Not one at a time in a field hospital, systematically, over years. Another pause. That matters. She thought about 12 people in a simulation center. She thought about Okonkwo writing things down. She thought about the next session and the one after that, and the facilities in the hospital system she hadn't met yet, where the same training would eventually run. Yeah, she said. It does. Here is what Emily Carter, and the woman she'd been before Emily Carter, had learned in the way you learn things that cost something. People will decide what you are before they've seen what you can do. They'll file you under a category that's convenient for them, that makes the social math of their environment simpler, and they'll defend that category against contradicting evidence for longer than is rational, because being wrong about a person requires a kind of humility that most institutions don't reward and most people haven't been trained for. That's not a counsel of despair. It's a description of a pattern that you can work with once you see it clearly. The thing about being underestimated is that it's not only a wound, it's also a kind of cover. You can do a lot of useful work when people have already decided you're not worth watching. You can be present in rooms where important things happen and not be the target of the defensive maneuvering that status-conscious people direct at each other. You can pay attention without anyone thinking to pay attention to you. Emily had used that for 4 years to survive. She was going to use it differently now. Not to hide, but to build. Not to stay out of sight, but to move without the friction that comes from people who are more interested in hierarchy than in what's actually happening in front of them. She'd walked into Harbor Ridge Medical Center as a woman with a blank resume and a body that remembered things her identity wasn't supposed to know. She'd been mocked and dismissed and processed out through institutional channels that were designed to reward the visible over the real. And then the real had asserted itself, the way it always eventually does. Not with drama, but with consequence. A man who'd fallen 15 feet going into surgery because she'd felt the wrong quality of pain in his stillness. A pediatric patient breathing normally because someone in that room had worked at the edge of what was possible until the impossible became a viable option. 12 people in a simulation center who would now catch things they would previously have missed and who would teach those things to 12 more, and so on, forward into a future she wouldn't live to see the end of. She was not a hero. Heroes are clean, and their motivations are simple, and their victories are complete. Emily Carter was not clean, and her motivations were layered, and her victory, such as it was, came with 4 years of compression and one field hospital situation she'd carried wrong in a sealed record for longer than was fair. And she was still, at this moment in her kitchen on a Thursday in February, a woman who got up every morning and made herself useful and went to bed some nights with the weight of what she used to be sitting at the edge of her chest. But she was here. She had chosen to be here. She had built something here with the skills she had, and the history she carried, and the name she'd constructed, and the person she'd become inside it, and it was imperfect and ongoing and real. She picked up her pen. She went back to the curriculum. Outside, Phoenix was going about its evening, the ordinary, unknowing life of a city that had no idea what had moved through it in the last several months, what had been built and dismantled and rebuilt in its emergency rooms and parking lots and federal courtrooms and simulation centers. The work continued. It always did. And for the first time in a very long time, Emily was not bracing